At the beginning of this century, life may have been simpler, but staying healthy was a lot harder. Medical care was poor. Contaminated food and water were commonplace, resulting in disease outbreaks which often killed thousands of people at a time. Life expectancy was a mere 45 years. The typical farmer's produce could only feed 7 people, and the food was not always safe. Today, many of yesterday's killer plagues have been eliminated. Food and waterborne diseases are now rare occurrences. Our typical farmer can feed nearly 80 people, and our life expectancy has risen to 75 years. We're the healthiest we've ever been. Or are we?
It is clear that cancer rates have escalated to epidemic proportions.
Millions of individuals are drinking a toxic soup of weed killers.
That we're forcing children to be exposed to something that will compromise effectively their entire life.
You can't even eat an apple without being exposed to an average of about 3.5 pesticides per apple.
Is modern technology doing us in? What does a close look at controversies like pesticides on food, dioxin in the environment, or food irradiation really show us? Has science put us under siege? Or are we really seeing science under siege? Washington's Yakima Valley, home to the nation's largest community of apple growers. For most farmers, the unpredictability of the apple business is a part of everyday life.
Farmers are willing to accept a lot of risks. We accept weather risks, we accept some marketing risks. We're really one of the few business people in the world that grow a crop here in the United States and then we ask what somebody will give us for it.
However, in February 1989, the apple community was struck by a disaster of a completely different nature. The chemical dimenazide, better known as the Alar apple growth regulator, was reported to be incredibly deadly. An estimated 40 million Americans first learned about it on CBS's 60 Minutes.
And who is most at risk? Children who may someday develop cancer from this one chemical called dimenazide.
The reaction to the story was overwhelming. Schools yanked apple products from their lunch menus. Stores pulled apples and applesauce from their shelves. Even children panicked.
We recall at least one inquiry from a 9-year-old who asked us if she would get cancer from all the apple juice she drank from her baby bottle.
One mother even had the state police pull over a school bus because her child had an apple in his lunch pail. And apple growers found they could barely give their apples away.
After the apple scare came out, we were forced to ship a large percentage of this fruit to cattle farmers in Oregon to feed their cattle.
Washington State lost an estimated $500 million, and many farmers were devastated, whether they had used Alar or not. And smaller farmers lost everything.
For guys that were on the verge or didn't have a lot of equity, they didn't make it.
Despite the fact that Alar had been in use for 21 years without controversy, only 4 months later, its manufacturer suddenly announced its discontinuation. So the Alar debate came to an end. But was all this panic necessary? What were the facts behind the scare? Alar was first developed in the early 1960s. It made apples ripen more uniformly and extended their shelf life by several months. The result was better apples at lower prices. The U.S. Department of Agriculture approved Alar in 1966. But in the 1980s, controversy arose. Lab tests found that Alar and its breakdown chemical, UDMH, appeared to cause a high incidence of tumors in mice. For some, the danger was clear.
Alar and its breakdown product, UDMH, is a probable human carcinogen and should have been banned probably earlier than it was banned.
However, many leading scientists found flaws with the Alar studies.
Okay. I don't think Alar was causing any cancer. Again, you want rules. You say you don't want it more than a certain amount in baby food or whatever. But again, it was another one of these hype things.
The main objection scientists raised concerned the dosage of Alar in the tests. There is a dose referred to as the MTD, or maximum tolerable dose, which is the highest amount of chemical an animal can withstand before it dies outright. This dose was apparently exceeded. When a scientific panel pointed this out, the proposed EPA LR ban was postponed. At this point, the environmental group NRDC, or Natural Resources Defense Council, hired a public relations firm to convince the country that LR was a tremendous threat. Feeling the pressure, the EPA ordered new mice trials with an LR dose that was now 4 times the MTD. In comparison, this dose was 35,000 times that which children might have. Not surprisingly, 80% of the mice died outright. But the desired effect had been achieved. Some mice developed tumors, benign, non-cancerous tumors. The NRDC then insisted that these studies supported the claim in their report, Intolerable Risk, which said children were at tremendous cancer risk from LR. Although the report had not been peer-reviewed, after being featured on 60 Minutes, everyone seemed convinced.
If you want to live, don't eat apples.
Even some journalists were surprised by the amount of coverage and the lack of skepticism.
Yes, and that is very difficult to explain why the media decided to drop all semblance of credibility just for LR. It remains that, in fact, they did do so, that they did not even begin to listen to the other side for perhaps a week, and by then the damage was done.
One reason for the coverage was that journalists always seemed to take the word of celebrities over scientific experts.
We don't know if it's very dangerous. We don't know if it's a little bit dangerous. We don't know if it's dangerous only to infants and small children.
It was mostly the NRDC's recruiting of Meryl Streep that resulted in so much unskeptical coverage. But actual experts like C. Everett Koop knew stacked mice trials when he saw them.
I care deeply about children, and if ALAR ever had posed a health hazard, I would have said something about it then, and I would certainly say something about it now. But the truth is that ALAR never did pose a health problem.
Despite the questionable tactics, some feel the measures were necessary.
And if people have disagreements about the way that the PR campaign was managed, well, that's life. It's a chemical that's toxic, should have been out of the food supply. It is out of the food supply now. Very few apple growers were really hurt, and the apple supply is still there.
Red Delicious apples are certainly still around, but there aren't as many of them. Without LR, they can't hang on the trees as long. And the effects from the crisis are still being felt today.
Ever since the ALR crisis, the prices remained low to catastrophic. Last year, I left most of these apples on the tree to fall off as overripes. What didn't get hauled away just laid on the ground and rotted.
There may have been worse consequences. Many Washington farmers feel that 6 years of losses after LR were too much for the owner of this orchard.
This was a Red Delicious orchard owned by one of my neighbors. He was in the process of taking out the trees and converting to something that could be economically supportive. Unfortunately, a couple of weeks ago, he was found dead in his pickup from a heart attack.
Ultimately, it seems ironic that a beneficial chemical with no record of harming anyone could so easily be forced off the market just by questionable mice trials, a gullible media, and a crusading movie star.
I have not seen a movie since '89 starring or even including Meryl Streep. She cost me my last dollar. Yeah.
Has modern industrial society ruined the environment? Are we now suffering and dying because of it?
The escalating increase in cancer rates over recent decades is a reflection of exposure to avoidable carcinogens in air, in water, and food in the workplace.
Now more than ever, modern industry produces ever-increasing amounts of chemicals that pose unknown hazards to our health. Even the most basic staples of everyday life seem dangerous.
In the majority of cities that we studied, there was 5 and 6 and even up to 9 different pesticides in a single glass of water. We also know that in many foods, for example, apples, we can find up to 9 different pesticides. So a child in a community where there's 9 pesticides in the drinking water has a glass of water and follows that up with some apple, and he's suddenly been exposed to 18 pesticides all before lunch.
But just because these chemicals exist, does that mean they're hazardous? How can we tell if a chemical is dangerous or not? Today, we depend on epidemiology and animal testing to give us these answers. Epidemiology, the study of disease in human populations, provides important results, if not fast results.
It takes 3 or 5 years to do a study. It can sometimes be longer. If you need to do a study where you actually assign the exposure and then wait for the events to occur, it can be a 15 or 20-year enterprise.
That's the last thing a politician wants to hear when faced with an alleged health crisis. We get quicker results from animal tests, where scientists dose mice or rats with high concentrations of a chemical. However, different species react differently to the same substances. 1/3 of the time, a test chemical that causes cancer in a mouse will not cause cancer in a rat. In short, a mouse is not a tiny man, and people concerned about public health are faced with difficulties.
Animal studies ask the wrong question but answer it well, while epidemiology asks the right question but answer it poorly. Animal studies, of course, are the wrong species, and the doses we're talking about are usually very high. And so this great answer, which is very well controlled, may not be all that important. Whereas human studies, we have the right species, and we're talking about doses that are relevant for people. But the exposures are hard to measure, and people are hard to assess, and it's hard.
The high dosages in animal tests may be very misleading. They seem to indicate that food itself is dangerous.
27 chemicals have been tested in roasted coffee. There are over 1,000 chemicals in roasted coffee. They've only tested 27. 19 are carcinogens. So you get more carcinogens in 1 cup of coffee than pesticide residues get in a year.
In fact, animal testing shows a surprising amount of natural substances to be carcinogenic. Almost every fruit and vegetable in the supermarket contains chemicals which cause cancer in high doses. Bananas, broccoli, carrots, orange juice, peaches, and turnips all contain natural carcinogens. Does this somehow mean that fruits and vegetables are dangerous?
Again, it doesn't mean fruits and vegetables are bad for you. That's the wrong logical jump. What it means is we know that fruits and vegetables are good for you. What it means is that low doses of chemicals aren't bothering us. We can deal with them. So it's the high doses that are giving you the false result.
So are the small amounts of chemicals in our water and food too low to hurt us? Is there a safe threshold?
In every instance when we've titrated chemicals down to the lowest possible level, we don't find a so-called safe threshold.
Concern that there is no safe level of carcinogens has driven the government's regulation of food additives for decades. However, even some regulators see this as a double standard.
If the traditional food standard were as tough as the additive standard, absolutely right, we wouldn't be eating food. There's hardly any food that doesn't have carcinogens in it.
In fact, if we were to eliminate everything that is carcinogenic in high doses, the human race would soon be extinct. Even if you could find a food free of carcinogens, you couldn't cook it since cooking creates carcinogens. Nor could you eat the food raw since saliva and digestive bacteria are rodent carcinogens. Sexual hormones, too, cause cancer in rodents. So if you can't eat and can't reproduce, at least you can still breathe, right? Wrong. Even oxygen in extremely high doses has caused tumors in laboratory rodents. It seems that simply by living, we all accept that there must be a safe threshold for carcinogens. To put some of our risks in perspective, many scientists turn to this index, which ranks carcinogens. Here, we can see LR ranked next to a banned insecticide and the natural carcinogens in tap water and peanut butter. All these hazards are dwarfed by the ethyl alcohol carcinogen contained in every 12-ounce glass of beer. This sounds like good news, but aren't we in the middle of a cancer epidemic? It is true that we have more cancer cases than ever before, but experts insist this does not prove an epidemic.
But basically what has been happening, that in the U.S. overall, you've had an aging population. Tuberculosis, other diseases have been controlled by antibiotics. Therefore, there are a lot more old people to die for cancer. So automatically, you have an epidemic of old people.
However, some age-adjusted cancer rates do still show a rise. But we need to remember that modern diagnostic technology allows us to diagnose cancers earlier and more often. In fact, deaths from cancer are basically unchanged or declining, which does not bear out the idea of a cancer epidemic. So what is causing the cancer we do have? Even though cancer is common, assessing the specific cause of any individual cancer is very difficult. Even experts admit they are unsure what causes most cancers.
When we say we don't know, we know that they're probably related to a number of factors, but the exact mechanisms, exact factors, remain to be more fully analyzed.
Because of these difficulties, the best experts can do is to advocate basic cancer prevention priorities. And is avoiding pesticides one of them?
No, pesticides lower cancer rates because the main causes of cancer are not eating your fruits and vegetables because you're not getting your vitamins, and smoking. And you can see that with the Seventh-day Adventists. The Seventh-day Adventists have half the cancer mortality rate of the rest of us, and they live 2 or 3 years longer. Why? Because they don't smoke, they don't drink, and they're mostly vegetarians. I don't think you have to be a vegetarian, but if you're eating your 5 portions of fruits and vegetables a day, your heart disease rate is lower, your cancer rate's lower, your cataract's lower. So fruits and vegetables have been a major factor in lowering cancer rates, and what makes fruits and vegetables cheaper? Pesticides.
So if we were to eliminate all pesticides in the name of health concerns, fruits and vegetables might become unaffordable to the people who need to eat them the most, poor Americans.
Half the urban black population is at a level of folic acid in their blood where they're getting chromosome breaks because they're not eating enough fruits and vegetables. I mean, those are really important things.
Since poor Americans only have so much money to spend on food, if they can't afford to buy fruits and vegetables, they won't. Making fruits and vegetables more expensive in an effort to protect people is sure to increase cancer rates as a result. Clearly, what is more important than parts per trillion of chemical residues are dietary and lifestyle choices that reduce our cancer risks. In fact, our fears about synthetic chemicals may turn out to be utterly misplaced.
The safest thing that you can eat today is a food additive. It may not be the tastiest, you may not like it, it may be synthetic, but it's been tested thoroughly, and they don't allow food additives, direct food additives that are carcinogens in the diet. You cannot say that for any natural food.
Times Beach was once a flourishing Missouri community until flood cleanup operations discovered that the town's topsoil had been contaminated. Residents were told to stay away from the river they had been swimming in for years and not to eat the fish. Finally, the government decided to buy out Times Beach entirely.
In Times Beach.
The residents' lives were changed forever.
Devastating. It just upsets your whole life. I don't think my life has ever been the same. It won't ever be the same again. Took away my security, the neighbors, the people I was used to being around.
The once prosperous town of Times Beach is now little more than a deserted field. And the invisible danger behind all these events? The chemical TCDD, commonly known as dioxin. Dioxin is an unintentional byproduct of many everyday industries and is now so widespread it can be found virtually anywhere and in anyone. Arnold Schechter has studied dioxin levels in Americans for many years.
To our big surprise, we found that everyone we looked at in the general population had surprisingly high levels of dioxins, and this was unexpected.
Since nearly everyone now has dioxins in their blood, the potential health implications are staggering.
The weight of the evidence points in the same direction: increase in cancer, birth defects, developmental problems, immune deficiency, endocrine disorders, and a host of other disorders.
These are effects some Times Beach residents can vouch for.
There are people that have suffered reproductive problems, ovarian cysts, miscarriages.
Dioxin was largely an unknown chemical until lab studies found that a mere 6 microgram dose killed guinea pigs outright. There was little debate about dioxin's toxicity.
Dioxin is known to be a very toxic material, probably the most toxic material made by man.
There was much debate, however, as to the relevance of these findings.
And then we always have to be careful that this is the most toxic chemical we know of in experimental animals.
And even among animals of similar species, like hamsters and guinea pigs, results differ widely. It takes 5,000 times the guinea pig's dose to kill a hamster. This raises an obvious question: how to study the effects of dioxin on a totally different species, humans.
Obviously, these are toxic chemicals, so it would be unethical and illegal to dose humans deliberately with highly toxic chemicals like the dioxins.
But some occupational workers are exposed to large amounts of dioxin. The 1991 NIOSH study surveyed over 5,000 workers in chemical plants and found high levels of dioxin in their blood. A few excess cancers were found, but some were lung cancers, and many workers' smoking habits were not accounted for. Nor was there mention of exposure to other potentially deadly chemicals. Dioxin expert Michael Goff has studied the NIOSH report extensively.
Anyway, the whole point of this is that these men we don't know much about their smoking. We don't know anything about their exposures to other chemicals in most cases. And to reach into this population and say that dioxin causes an excess, in my mind, it's just a great leap of faith.
With the best occupational evidence seeming inconclusive, proof might still come from one last source: industrial accidents. On July 10, 1976, an explosion at a chemical reactor near the town of Seveso, Italy, blanketed the townspeople with tremendous concentrations of dioxin. Many townspeople soon reported illnesses like chloracne, and officials predicted an epidemic of health problems.
The health of these people was and is still in danger.
Many women aborted their babies for fear of birth defects, but examinations found the dioxin caused no deformations. And to this very day, follow-up studies of citizens have not found excessive health problems. Since even Seveso seems unaffected by dioxin, many scientists feel the evidence speaks for itself.
I am not convinced that the human population, meaning the general population, I'm not even convinced that occupational individuals, I'm not even convinced the accidental communities have had sufficient exposure to cause health effects in humans.
In fact, when the EPA studied the evidence in a 1991 reassessment, it concluded that dioxin was not the hazard it was thought to be. This did not instill a great deal of trust in the government with former Times Beach residents.
I thought they were crazy, honestly, because they say, one time they say, you can't live there, and next time they say, oh, there ain't nothing wrong with it. But yet, we can't live there.
But didn't the residents of Times Beach suffer numerous health problems due to dioxin exposure? Larry Rice worked with the Times Beach community and feels that residents told they were being poisoned simply believed it.
And I don't want anybody exposed to any kind of real danger. But at the same time, I see psychosomatic diseases rise, and that's what was disturbing me with this whole process.
However, there did seem to be some obvious disease clusters. Marilyn Leisner recalls a friend of hers.
She suffered 2 miscarriages and had the second child that had the neuroblastoma. And this past year, the father died at age 45 with neuroblastoma. 3 family members suffered and died from the same health problems.
Government researchers investigated the health of Times Beach residents, although with some skepticism about the relevance of disease clusters.
There's an expression, clusters don't muster, and I think that's where it comes from, that you get in and you do the full study and you rarely can come to a good conclusion because the numbers of the people in the area are so small.
Like the previous studies, Times Beach investigations found no more health problems than average Americans have. This finding was not well received.
There was all this publicity about the vast Agent Orange cover-up, and these people felt that this was just another part of the government cover-up.
It's hard to persuade people if they are firmly convinced that something is so that it's not. But the nature of science is that we promise ourselves we will be dissuaded. I mean, that's why we do what we do. We think we know something, but science is being willing to say, no, you did the study, and the data clearly show that it wasn't there.
Even the most recent EPA dioxin reassessment is being redone since a review board insisted that the evidence showed no danger.
So I think what we're seeing here is a realization in the scientific community anyway, an appreciation that the horrible health threat that was posed by dioxin simply isn't there.
In 1982, the government only had dioxin's animal evidence to go on, so the desire to err on the side of caution with Times Beach was understandable. In hindsight, however, the effect was like someone yelling fire in a crowded theater. Thousands were panicked and the consequences were severe. One resident committed suicide and others faced financial ruin.
How much money do you think you lost?
Last count, it was something over $250,000.
Millions were spent for very little gain.
The federal government spent $33 million to buy Times Beach, and the state of Missouri spent either 3 or 6 more. And so we have a game preserve.
Even many residents who were supposed to be protected now live in fear.
There were that percentage of people who would always wonder if a new health problem was because they were living there.
In fact, the head official in charge of the evacuation of Times Beach later said it was all a mistake. As commendable a motivation as erring on the side of caution was, many Times Beach residents feel the official response should have been, wait till the evidence is in.
I think it's a shame my kids will never be able to go back and show their kids where they grew up.
Vietnam, 1962. The Air Force decides to deny enemy troops the cover of dense jungle foliage and implements Operation Ranch Hand. For the next 9 years, members of this mission spray nearly 20 million gallons of herbicide onto the Vietnamese landscape. Major Jack Spay was a member of this mission.
The motto of the mission, well, it wasn't the motto of the mission, but it was a casual, one of the slogans was, only we can prevent forest.
Agent Orange, named after the orange stripe painted on its barrels, was the most popular defoliant and made up 11 million of the gallons sprayed. A minor contaminant of Agent Orange was dioxin. Years after the war, veterans did not seem to be very healthy. There were cases of skin rashes, heart attacks, cancer. Author Fred Wilcox remembers this time vividly.
I was surprised that I didn't see it in the newspapers all the time, because it seemed to me that there really was a very major issue, and that, in fact, people in California, New York, Ohio, all over the country were sick. Some of them were dying, and I wanted to get to the bottom of it, so that's where I started.
Many vets felt they had gotten to the bottom of it. Exposure to Agent Orange had caused their health problems. Agent Orange was killing them. It was a conclusion Fred Wilcox agreed with, and it became the basis for his book, Waiting for an Army to Die.
I concluded that it was Agent Orange because Agent Orange, of course, contains dioxin, and we all know about what dioxin does to animals.
At almost the same time, Pulitzer Prize-winning science journalist John Franklin also started working on the story. Franklin's editor promised unlimited time and resources to the story, and neither man had great love for the military or the chemical companies.
Kind of my slant at the time, and I think his, although he didn't really say this, was go get the bastards.
For both Wilcox and Franklin, the key to the story was face-to-face talks with veterans.
The more I traveled, the more people I interviewed, the more I read, the more I talked to people, the more passionate I got. I had a very passionate interest in this topic because it seemed to me to be a great tragedy, and it still seems to me to be a great tragedy.
Franklin, on the other hand, became more and more skeptical. Some of the stories weren't making sense.
Agent Orange, you know, was a clear liquid, and I would go out and talk to people, and they would report being dusted with an orange powder, sprayed with an orange liquid, an orange dye. I recall sitting in one fellow's apartment in Baltimore who told me how he was in his tank column. And he remembers very clearly how this orange liquid came raining down on them. And what he said was it had made him an alcoholic, and that it had made him too lazy to work.
Since many claims seemed unreliable, Franklin decided to focus on the soldiers who were undeniably exposed to Agent Orange, the members of Operation Ranch Hand, who did 90% of the spraying. For them, contact with Agent Orange was more than just a job. Sometimes it was an adventure.
They would open the bay doors because it's so hot, and they were low, and they were in the tropics. So they would open the bay doors while they were spraying, and the guys would stand in the doors. And of course, the Agent Orange spray would wash over them, and that would cool you off in that situation.
And if an airplane took battle damage inside and it punctured a pressure line, that material would spray all over the interior of the airplane until the flight engineer could reach up and shut the pump down.
One of the things that the people with Operation Ranch Hand did was when a new fellow would come into the outfit, they would all stand around in a circle, and he would drink a glass of Agent Orange. And often there were veterans who were there who would drink Agent Orange with them. And they would keep records, the way people keep records of how much blood they've given. And there were people who had drank 20 gallons of Agent Orange, and et cetera.
And the ranch handers do have amazing levels of dioxin in their blood. The average blood dioxin level is 10 times the national average. Some levels are actually 150 times the national average.
That in itself says that we were, you know, obviously the right group to study and do an epidemiology study on our group.
For over 15 years, the Air Force has been studying the health of the ranch handers. Cancer, heart disease, immune system disorders, all aspects of their health have been analyzed.
It turned out that their health was somewhat better than average, and that's not exactly an argument for drinking Agent Orange, but in any event, that's how it came out.
In particular, there's no excess of cancers, and there's no excess of birth defects among their children. Their children have been followed to the age of 21, so that not only do we know about birth defects, but we also know about learning disabilities and so forth, and there's just nothing there.
By this point, it had become obvious to us that the story wasn't about Agent Orange, that the story was about something quite different. It was a socio-political story.
The herbicide 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, of which herbicide Orange was, a 50-50 mixture, killed the hell out of weeds, but it hasn't hurt people.
If this is true, what brought so much attention to the Agent Orange issue in the first place? One factor was a 1970 study the North Vietnamese government conducted, which said Agent Orange was causing birth defects among their children. Many scientists insisted this was an incredibly shoddy study, yet the media accepted it readily, without questioning a possible bias.
Wouldn't you say that that would be an appropriate paper for the Vietnamese to have published in 1970? They weren't our best friends at that time.
The main cause of the Agent Orange alarm, though, was the growing number of Vietnam veterans who claimed health problems.
This one fellow brought in his daughter who had some severe congenital defect.
Well, I met a lot of people with the Straits, Jerry Strait and their family, out in the Midwest. Their daughter was born with just half of her brain.
He made the pronouncement that 1.5% of the returning Vietnam veterans were having deformed babies. And we all printed that, and I remember the New York Times printed it, I remember we printed it, and we all sort of went, wow. And then later on, as we were looking into it, it turns out that's the normal percentage. We just don't realize that.
So how good or bad is the health of Vietnam veterans on the whole? Studies have been conducted comparing veterans to control populations who also suffer from cancer, diabetes, and other common problems.
So it's not a surprise that the veterans are sick and that they have some children who are sick. Okay. If we took a group of non-veterans, we'd find the same thing. In fact, when we do take groups of non-veterans and compare them to veterans, the incidence of these things is the same. But that doesn't help a person who is sick, or particularly if has a sick child, and has heard about Agent Orange and dioxin, and blames it on, and he makes this connection.
There was a guy who had brain cancer who said that I died in Vietnam and didn't even know it, which always struck me as a sort of a statement that, I mean, it was beautifully in context for this particular story because it's a beautiful statement. It's haunting, has no truth whatsoever.
For many scientists, the continued lack of human reactions to dioxin makes one conclusion clear.
My feeling is that I know that dioxin is one of the most potent chemicals around, certainly one of the most fascinating chemicals around, but I'm not convinced that there's any evidence at all that shows that dioxin produces a risk for man at currently low levels. I think the ranch hand study says basically the same thing.
Then why was a $250 million settlement awarded to veterans by the chemical companies who manufactured Agent Orange? Dr. Robert Rubin had the opportunity to speak with one of the board members who awarded the settlement.
And I said, on what basis have you made this billion-dollar settlement with the veterans? And I think the closest I can paraphrase his answer was it was politics, totally.
Others are less convinced.
Well, yeah, the government's response was quite simply a cover-up, and it went on for years and years.
There's an unfortunate theme that's in vogue right now in this country, and that is everything has to be a cover-up. Everything the government does, whether it be local or federal, has got to be a cover-up. Someone can choose to take that position if it satisfies their belief in that outcome, but I just don't share that view.
The only suspicious silence Franklin encountered came from the news media when it was time for his exposé's publication. Franklin remembers his editor's decision.
To Jack Lemmon's credit, he published it, and it went out over the wires. And to the best of my knowledge, not another paper in the country published it.
And so the impression has clearly been created among thousands, if not millions of veterans, that they are little more than ticking time bombs. News to the contrary goes ignored.
I think that the science that's gone on this subject should be reassuring to everybody. It certainly is reassuring to me. It should be reassuring to the people, all the folks that served in Vietnam.
For now, Vietnam veterans have little such reassurance. But as the case for dioxin's extreme toxicity continues to crumble, the tide cannot help but eventually turn.
One of these days, Agent Orange will be called the Agent Orange hoax.
Mankind has long been fearful of atomic energy, and with good reason. After all, radiation can kill without being seen or even felt. Perhaps these mysterious qualities gave rise to many of our old fears about what radiation can do.
Giant leeches.
You think that if some animal life was close by, not close enough to be killed, but close enough to feel the effects of a radioactive energy that's...
A mutation. A type of gigantism of some common animal.
Today, however, radiation is understood very well, and many experts feel that radiation is the best way to keep America's food supply free of disease. The process called food irradiation uses a burst of high-level radiation to kill bacteria living in food. And in today's hospitals, irradiated food is already standard for cancer patients. This raises a question, though. If irradiated food is so safe that it is standard for cancer patients, why isn't it more widely available in the U.S. food supply? Or is it perhaps not as safe as it seems? Is irradiation deadly? For microorganisms and bacteria in food, the answer is yes. A short burst kills these pathogens instantly. But since the normal 100 kilorad dose would be fatal to humans, some irradiation opponents feel the food must be dangerous and have made their concerns public.
100,000 rads of radiation they call low level. 600 rads, as you know from Chernobyl, 600 rads kills a person. You're talking about food, not people. 100,000 rads are going to be using our apples. The cells of
That does sound deadly. On the other hand, we eat food all the time that's been cooked with lethal levels of energy. This pizza will be baked at 700 degrees Fahrenheit for 10 minutes, and that could certainly kill a person. Yet we don't think twice about eating it once it's cooled off. George Pauly is director of the FDA's Center for Food Safety and has studied the process for many years.
If you shine a light bulb on food, on yourself, on a table, when you turn off that light bulb, there's no light coming out of you. It's dissipated. The radiation goes into food, it's dissipated into a small amount of chemical change and a slight rise in temperature.
But what does this chemical change involve? Food irradiation opponents point out that new food molecules called radiolytic products, or RPs, are created by the ionizing energy. Although no more than 30 RP parts per million of food are generated, there is concern as to whether they can be harmful.
And these are a series of compounds, some of which are present naturally at low levels in food, like benzene, but others like peroxides, epoxides, and carbonyls fall into the family of chemicals which are associated with cancer.
However, even if we assume all RPs to be carcinogenic, we mustn't forget that all traditional cooking methods produce carcinogens. Any temperature in excess of 212 degrees, whether from boiling or barbecuing, produces at least 10 cancer-causing chemicals. Since no RPs have been proven toxic, it appears that irradiation can actually make food less carcinogenic. And since no feeding trials have ever found health effects, irradiated food is considered the safest thing cancer patients can eat. The food is also standard for another small group of individuals with whom officials want to take no chances: astronauts and NASA space programs. But for everyday consumers, there are many other preservation processes. Is food irradiation really necessary?
And I see no reason at all why the American public should be willing to take a chance in transforming its entire diet because of self-interested opinions, unsubstantiated opinions of a small number of self-interested scientists and a very powerful industry that wants to get rid of their radioactive junk.
The question is not whether we need another food process. We have done well in this country. The question is whether the government should say it's illegal to use another food process that might provide a food that consumers would prefer, that may be able to provide some health benefits.
One health benefit could be the reduction of contaminated food. Every year, 1 out of every 10 Americans suffers some symptom of food poisoning, usually mild, but sometimes fatal. For reasons like these, food irradiation is currently in use in 37 other countries worldwide. But in the United States, the process is still blocked by controversy. We can at least be grateful that anti-irradiation campaigns have not denied this food to these cancer patients, whose safety margin for health is very small. As for those of us who would like to have a choice whether or not to buy irradiated food, we're simply out of luck.
My intuitive feeling is that the public would prefer it in some cases, not in others. But they really haven't had a chance to decide, because there's only one way you vote on irradiated food, and that's to go to the store to buy it. And if it's not there, you can't really choose.
In the not-too-distant past, finding the cause of misfortune was pretty straightforward. Then, as now, people suffered from disease and death. Then, as now, people looked for reasons.
When you have a brain tumor, you want to know why, and you want to know who did it. And in this day and climate, you might even want to sue them, right? There was a time in the past when you would blame the devils, you would blame witchcraft, you would blame Satan. In a lot of cultures, they still blame Satan. Our Satan has become science and technology.
There are uncomfortable parallels between the witch hunts of the past and some of today's risk assessments. In witch hunts, no method was too extreme to indict a suspect. Today, if one series of animal lab tests don't indict a chemical, we try a higher concentration or another species. And if necessary, the media find they can take any minuscule risk and turn it into screaming headlines.
And that makes it awfully difficult for people to say enough is enough.
because the question then comes around, one case of cancer is too much, but if it costs you $100 million to avoid one case of cancer, which is a theoretical case to begin with, and you've got an infantile mortality rate which is much above that of other countries, you have something very peculiar in your priority system.
If you're concentrating as an individual or as a country on the wrong fears, then by necessity you're not concentrating on the right ones. And so I see all the time that while people are worried about things that have almost no chance of killing them, they really don't give a lot of time and a lot of thought to things that have a much higher chance of killing them.
In part, this attitude is a luxury of civilized life. We think we can be contemptuous of new technology because we have tamed many of nature's threats. We begin to believe that nature is benign, and we forget the ravages of disease and starvation that once were commonplace.
We can imagine science and technology making Darth Vader. And we also forget what penicillin means.
And the bottom line is life expectancy gets longer every year. We're the healthiest we've ever been in history, and wealth enables us to be that.
Science and technology are what created our present-day health and comfort. From cholera to smallpox to polio, science has saved us from one siege after another. When we turn around and, in the name of eliminating risk, we put science under siege, we may end up taking the riskiest path of all.